Now we're back in plenary mode for the remainder of the forum. And in the next two sessions, we're actually moving into a very practical mode as well. We're going to spend this hour focused on the management of innovation. And you know, what an appropriate focus, since we're talking about turning points in management, a sort of a great transformation period. I mean, over 20 years ago, the great James March of Stanford University, he wrote about this fundamental tension in companies between these two activities that they have to pursue. And so the first is exploration, which is finding the, the new discoveries, the new solutions to problems, or whether it's a customer problem or an operational challenge, but discovering that new thing. That's exploration. The other thing is exploitation. So taking that thing that you've discovered and becoming, super efficient, super competitive in delivering that to the marketplace. And his observation was that companies are very much geared, very tooled to exploitation, and overwhelmingly so. Let's say maybe 95%, for sake of argument, focused on exploitation of what's already been discovered, and maybe spending something like 5% of their attention, their resources, on exploring the landscape, looking for the next new thing. Well, I think that today we realize that that companies have to change that tooling. They have to be retooled. I mean, we certainly have to make exploration, let's call it innovation, much more of a natural act instead of an unnatural act for companies. It has to become habitual, systematic. But that is a really big challenge for management, and management, whether we're talking at the level of practice or at the level of how it is taught, because as a discipline, management has been so much more about exploitation than about exploration. So I'm happy to be sharing the stage with four very smart and accomplished people who are adamantly focused on the management of innovation. Rita McGrath, Nilofer Merchant, Nancy Tennant, and Mark Merrill. And the way we're going to approach this hour, I mean, two of our panelists are in the business of advising firms, and two are in the trenches, very much trying to make innovation happen. So our approach is going to be to hear from the first two. We'll start off with Rita, and then Nilofer, each putting a set of ideas on the table based on their study of firms and advising of firms. And then we'll bring Nancy and Mark into the conversation to understand how they're making real progress. Rita McGrath is a business school professor. She's at Columbia University, Columbia Business School. Her last major article for Harvard Business Review was called Transient Advantage. And the clear signal with that title was to say that this notion of sustainable advantage is no longer valid. Advantage is, we have to make the assumption that advantages will be transient. Those ideas were much more fully developed in her book, which is called The End of Competitive Advantage, How to Keep Your Strategy Moving as Fast as Your Business. She wrote that with Alex Gourlay. I also want to mention a previous book of hers, this one with Ian McMillan. It was Discovery-Driven Growth. I'm sure many of you have read it. Discovery-Driven Growth, a breakthrough process to reduce risk and seize opportunity. So, Rita, what ideas would you like to share with us today?
Thank you very much, Julia. So it's a delight to be here. Richard and I have been talking for some time about this conference, and I'm excited to be here with so many like-minded souls. If I could get the slides that somewhere? Oh, there we go. Terrific. Okay, so the context that Julia mentioned is one that I think we need to have before us, and it's one that has bothered me for a long time, which is in strategy. For years, we've had this notion that the ultimate goal is to create a sustainable competitive advantage and then exploit that for a long time, as Julia mentioned. And I think that's fantastic if you can find one. The dilemma is that in more and more of our economy, it doesn't look like that. It looks like the slide you have before you, and I'm pleased Mark is here because this is the world he's in, right? This slide shows you exchanges of market share in the gaming business. And I would love to turn to Mark later and find out his perspective on living in that world. But, you know, you start off with arcade games, right? And then eventually those make way for console-based games. And then the console-based games make way for games that are played on general-purpose devices like computers, personal computers. And then in turn, those start to be edged out by games that are played on phones or inside other people's applications like Facebook. You know, and anybody who's ever unfriended someone because they asked for too many things on Farmville will know exactly what I'm talking about. And it's not to say that arcade games are gone, they're still there, but they are no longer the dominant force that they once were in that sector. So I think the principle here is if you have advantages that are created, they emerge, they enjoy their moment, and then they dissipate. Innovation cannot be an episodic thing. And what we see all the time is that companies really struggle with it. And when you ask executives, well, you know, why do you have such trouble innovating? What you get is all this stuff, right? So, oh, it's nobody's job and it falls between the cracks and you know, I don't get rewarded for it, or as we heard yesterday, it takes too long and it's too unpredictable and blah, 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 blah. You know, that's what you hear. And I would ask you to reflect on the comments you see on this slide and ask yourself the question, what do they all have in common? And what they all have in common is that they are all self-inflicted. As Clay said yesterday, God did not come down and say, this is the way we've got to run organizations. We do this to ourselves in the service of exploitation. And I think it's very important to come away from this conference realizing just because those things are there, we put them there. That doesn't mean we can't get rid of them. So I think it's an important thing to think about. Now, what should you be watching out for? What are the things in organizations that I always say are 5 ways to guarantee your innovation process is going to be completely dysfunctional? First, it's episodic. It comes and goes. There's bursts of enthusiasm. The one I love is innovation boot camps. You know, we're going to put everybody through the innovation boot camp. But because it's episodic, it sort of fades away, or worse yet, it gets killed off, and then people go, well, that was a lot of fun, but nothing really came out of it. So you need it to be a process, a consistent, ongoing process. The second big challenge for innovation is that in most exploitation-oriented organizations, resources are held hostage in the service of existing businesses. So let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine to yourselves that you are Mr. Sony Walkman at the height of that business's success. And what got you where you are? Well, AA batteries, little whirring gizmos that take content in album form from media and replay them with enormous fidelity so that you can hear it in a portable manner, right? So let's say you've come to a conference like the Drucker Forum and you say, wow, I really need to think about the future. What does the future hold for my business? And so you call up R&D and they send a delegation. And they tell you, guess what? In the future, no more AA batteries. No more whirring gizmos, in fact, no more albums, no more media. It's all going to be songs, and they're going to fly through the air and land on your hard drive. Oh, and one last thing, the music they reproduce is going to be less high quality than the music we can make with our current technology. You could be forgiven for saying, please go back to R&D where you can do minimal damage, right? I mean, that's a very scary prospect. So we've got to have some way of freeing resources from being trapped in the existing businesses and getting it to where they need to fund the future. Another big thing I see all the time is we try to force fit our innovations into existing structures. So I'll give an example. At DuPont, say 14, 15 years ago, the assets of the business, so the nylon business, the Kevlar business, the Tyvek business, and the business model all were in sync. Now, as DuPont began to move into more knowledge-intensive operations and services, what they found was that structure didn't work for them, because you could have a solution that required a little bit of Tyvek and maybe a piece of Nomex and a lot of consulting time. It didn't fit. They had to reorganize the company into what they called growth platforms to solve that problem. So if you're trying to force-fit innovations into places where they really don't fit, that's a clear sign it's probably not going to work all that well. We've been talking a lot at this conference about customer experience, and it is just so hard to get an accurate picture of the customer's experience. Some of you know this about me. I study corporate flops, big, bad failures that should have, that really shouldn't have ever happened. And here's some examples. Vegetable-flavored Jell-O to use with salads. Yum, huh? Doesn't that sound good? Or Nokia's N-Gage gaming phone. This was their attempt to strive to get some relevance in the gaming business. And it was terrific, actually, as a gaming device. It worked pretty well. The trouble was it didn't work so well as a phone. To use it, you had to stick it out of your ear like this. Not good. Or my all-time favorite, probably, of this category of lack of connection to the customer is when General Motors decided to go to China. They decided to focus effort on the driving experience for the driver. And so they defeatured the rest of the car to bring the cost down. Have any of you done business in China? If you're rich enough to afford a General Motors car in China, you're also rich enough to afford a driver. So I have this mental image of all these Chinese millionaires going to the back seat and like rolling down the thing manually. And you don't have to do very much intensive market research to find this out. This is something you could have known. So getting into the customer's experience. I was telling you about my flops file. You have to lose your parent company at least $50 million to get into my flops file. That's the bar. And it's getting very fat. I think I may have to raise the price of admission. But when you look at them over and over again, what you find is a consistent pattern of untested assumptions taken as facts, very few opportunities for low-commitment testing, kind of the antithesis of the agile and lean behaviors we've been talking about at this conference, And the assumptions people make are just crazy, like Revlon's line of Vital Radiance cosmetics. Cosmetics designed for women of a certain age, whom it turns out are not amused by being reminded of this at the cosmetics counter. It's not a good idea. And a lot at the root of this is trying to prove that you're right, rather than trying to learn what is true. And I think that's a pretty critical gap that a lot of our companies face. So you really need to think about learning. So what do? We were promised that this panel would give you some very practical, actionable things. How do you go about building an innovation proficiency? Step one, you have to have an appropriate governance and funding process that allows innovations to take a life of their own. So a very interesting example from years back is the IBM Emerging Business Opportunity Program, which many of you will have studied. And what it involved was taking a senior leader with great respect in the organization, somebody who knows where all the bodies are buried, pulling them out of their role, and then asking them to build up a new kind of organization appropriate to the task that they are trying to accomplish. So this photograph is of a guy named Ron Adkins, who was running the massive Unix business at IBM. And they pulled him out of that and said, we want you to build up a space for us in what was then called pervasive computing. Today, we would know that as the Internet of Things. And his job was to go and find out what the business model was, and once he's got some ideas about that, start pulling out of the existing organization other units, which accomplishes two magical things. Thing number one, it weakens the inertia of the existing business. Thing number two, it gives the new business revenue, which in many organizations is political power. And then you need a governance process behind that. And in this case, he reported directly to the head of the EBO movement, who reported directly to the CEO. So there was a clear line of sight to the funding and management processes of the innovation. I talk a lot about balanced portfolios. I believe that's where you need to really have oversight. You need to know what you're doing that supports today's business, what you're doing that's going to fund tomorrow's business, what you're doing that are classified as options. Small investments you make today, which gives you the right but not the obligation to make a big investment going forward. And if you're curious about options, I talk about this all the time, but you want to have that portfolio. It needs to reflect your strategy. It needs to have an appropriate balance of resources. On the subject of portfolios, the thing not to do is make your fledgling new options compete with your existing business for resources, because they're two different things. You need to have pockets of money that are set aside, and staff that are set aside. I'm a big believer in testing assumptions and letting the emergence of your resource allocation reflect your learning. So in the beginning, when you don't know, 3D printing, nanotechnology, brand new flexible forms of battery, we don't know what those are going to be, and anybody who tells you he does is crazy. What you have is a very wide range of assumptions. So what you want to spend is very little at that moment. As your assumptions become narrower, as you start to turn them into facts, you can invest more with comfort. And that's really the basic principle of learning, and it's very consistent with the lean thing. Intelligent failures. Intelligent failures. What makes a failure an intelligent one rather than a stupid one? Well, you had a plan, so you knew what went wrong. You were able to test that plan so you could learn in rapid succession. You were able to tolerate failure because it was fast and it was cheap, and you're able to share the messages of that failure. So take Amazon.com and their foray into third-party selling. Well, the first thing they tried was auctions, and that didn't work. And the reason for third-party selling was, they said, we built this platform, what else can we do with it? So they tried auctions, that didn't work. eBay really understood that business a lot better than they did. Then they said, well, we still think it's a good opportunity. They tried a thing called Amazon Z Shops. Most of you may remember that. So these were third-party sellers, but on a separate web page. And you had to do a lot of work to find them, and that didn't work either. And they finally took the bold step of saying, okay, we're going to put suppliers' products right there on the front page next to the ones that we sell, and everything's going to be really transparent. That now represents about a third of their total revenue. Revenue they wouldn't have had if they'd only done proprietary Amazon-only orders. So it's been a very interesting thing for them, but they didn't get that right away. They had to learn. They had to learn what that business really was. We talked a lot about the customer. It is very, very common for people trying to do innovation to start with where we are rather than where the customer is and what outcome is the customer trying to drive. I call it competing in arenas, where an arena is a stack of addressable resources relating to some kind of customer outcome that you might be able to contest. It may not be within your industry. It may be something completely different. As you think about your innovation process, a very common mistake I see people making is they say, oh, it's all about the ideas. We need to have these boot camps and brainstorms and get the good idea. Honestly, that's not usually the problem. A colleague of mine wrote an article where he actually tracked down how many ideas it took to get one commercializable product, and the number was 3,000. By the time you're done with this conference, you'll have 15 ideas, right? Ideas are not the problem. Here's where the problem is: incubation. Taking the idea and turning it into something you can test, you can prototype, you can put in front of a customer, get some feedback, get some reaction. That's much harder. So it's not the idea. And then it's acceleration. You can think of your existing business like a highway, and it's moving very quickly. Your little businesses are on the ramp. You need to have a process for bringing them up so that they can flow together with the highway. Lastly, sort of an overall comment: what does this mean for us as individuals? And I think what we're experiencing is a move from the world of innovation being managed by the organization and the organization looking after your own career to, in many cases, our success in our companies is going to be a function of how entrepreneurial we can be. So I'd like to leave you with that thought, which is think about being an entrepreneur within the context of your own business. Okay, concluding thoughts. There is a new playbook. Good news, we know a lot about it, and the people on this panel have seen some of it and will be able to share it with you. You can learn about it. It's not a mystery. There's a lot we know, so it doesn't have to be so scary. And lastly, and here's where competitive advantage comes in, if you can build a pipeline faster, if you can innovate more quickly, I think that can actually give you an edge over companies that really are struggling with those barriers to innovation that I opened up with. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll turn it over.